Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein. For weeks, Republicans have framed the Senate runoff as a clash between former football coach Derek Dooley and Congressman Mike Collins. That's only part of what this race is about. At its core, this runoff has become something more. It's become a fight over the future of the Georgia Republican Party, the direction that the Republican Party will take over the next not just months, but years to come. It's a debate we've seen brewing ever since Donald Trump transformed the GOP. And now Republican voters get to decide which path they want to take against Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. Do they want the candidate backed by Governor Brian Kemp and some of the party's traditional power brokers? Or do they want the candidate who argues that he's the most unapologetic MAGA warrior in the race? This isn't only Dooley versus Collins. It's about electability, the argument that Derek Dooley is making, or authenticity, the argument that Mike Collins is making. Or at least that's how each side sees it right now. Dooley's argument is pretty straightforward. Republicans have lost 3 major statewide federal races since 2020. They, of course, lost the presidential race in 2020. They lost the runoffs that Raphael, Warnock, and Jon Ossoff won. And, of course, they lost the Senate re-election campaign from Raphael Warnock in 2022. Kemp's allies, they point to the same lesson every time. They say the GOP can't just win the core Republican voters anymore. It has to win independents and swing voters in Metro Atlanta and throughout the state. That's how Kemp beat Stacey Abrams in 2022. That's why Dooley keeps talking about November. That's at the core of his message. I went out to one of his campaign stops in Eatonton, Georgia, kind of East Georgia, about an hour from Atlanta. And it's what he told voters at the stop I covered. This race should be decided with their heads as much as their hearts. November, November, November. It's why Kemp keeps reminding Republicans about the roughly 300,000 Georgians who voted for him in 2022, but also voted for Senator Warnock over Republican Senate nominee Herschel Walker in that same election. The warning is very clear. Don't nominate someone who gives Ossoff an easy target. Mike Collins sees the world very differently. His argument is essentially Republicans don't need another lecture about electability. They need a fighter. He finished first in the primaries just a few weeks ago, and he argues that that makes him the true Trump candidate, the true MAGA warrior. And he believes voters want someone who's going to aggressively champion Trump's agenda rather than moderate it, rather than scale it back. The Collins campaign also rejects the idea that conservatism and electability are mutually exclusive. His message is that results on immigration, on taxes, on public safety, that those win elections, that he sees the state Republican Party in really 2 camps. There's the MAGA base. He also told me, he kind of described it broadly as the Metro Atlanta voters. Those are the Republican-leaning voters who want more results, and they don't care exactly how they're done. They're not maybe in love with Donald Trump, but they're willing to vote for a Trump-backed candidate who can prove they've accomplished things, whether it be in Washington or back home in Georgia. What's fascinating about this debate is that it extends far beyond the June runoff, which is just in a few days from now. Jason Shepard, he's the former Cobb GOP chair. He's also a Kennesaw State University political scientist. He told me this runoff is becoming a test of whether Republican primary voters want to continue Kemp's coalition building approach or move a different direction. And that's really the bigger question here at play. Governor Kemp's model produced landslide victories in 2022, 7 or 8 points over Stacey Abrams. But Trump's influence inside the party has only grown since then. Of course, with his re-election in 2024, he's now the sort of the other big name in Georgia Republican politics. You've got Governor Kemp, the most popular Republican according to AJC polls. And you've got Donald Trump, whose sway, whose thumbprint, whose influence, not just, of course, in Georgia politics, but throughout the nation, is clear in every primary vote, whether it be in Indiana, whether it be in Kentucky, whether it be in Louisiana or Texas. And of course, we'll see that imprint in Georgia in the next couple of weeks. So which lesson matters more? The general election success of Brian Kemp or the primary election dominance of Donald Trump? So far, of course, the president remains on the sidelines. But Georgia Republicans, Georgia voters, they're about to answer that fundamental question. Another runoff we're watching very closely, of course, beyond the governor's race, which we've talked about at length on this podcast earlier this week. For all the talk of Democratic unity, there's a fascinating split developing in the Secretary of State runoff. Raphael Warnock, he's backing former Judge Penny Brown Reynolds. Stacey Abrams is backing Dana Barrett. These are two of the most influential Democrats in Georgia on opposite sides of the same race. It's also notable because Senator Warnock usually avoids getting involved in competitive Democratic primaries. There's a few exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, he stays out of these nasty internal party fights. At the same time, the party's power trio, Senator Warnock, Stacey Abrams, and Senator Jon Ossoff, they're all lining up behind State Senator Josh McLaurin in the lieutenant governor runoff. This is a fascinating race as well because you've got two rival candidates, both who served in the state Senate together. Josh McLaurin, he was the frontrunner for a long time, expected to have sort of an easy walk to the Democratic Party's nomination until the last minute. In a surprise move, Nabila Parks, one of his colleagues, not only decides to run in this race and instead of running for insurance commissioner, but she also steps down from her seat in the Georgia Senate, resigns to focus on her campaign. This has become a nasty, caustic, toxic battle between these two Democratic former caucus mates, right? They used to sit right near each other in the Georgia Senate. Now they're bitter rivals, but the party establishment, for the most part, is starting to line up behind State Senator Josh McLaurin. That is making this race even more fascinating. He was by a hair the leading vote getter in the May primary. He comes into it, I guess, as the sort of odds-on favorite, if you could call it that. There's very little polling in any of these races. All these campaigns are kind of going for the most part by feel. They're just hoping that the electorate is falling in the way they want the electorate to go, and they're going to be focusing on their base parties. It's something we're going to be watching very, very closely. Now, as we get closer to the June 16th runoff, there's kind of three different blocks of the electorate we're watching really closely in the Senate race. One, of course, are the Metro Atlanta voters who came out strongly for Derek Dooley. Derek Dooley's campaign really focuses TV messaging and some of its campaign stops on the vote-rich Metro Atlanta area in the closing days of the race. And Derek Dooley did really well in the core Metro Atlanta counties and some of the exurbs and surrounding Metro Atlanta. He also did well in Athens, Clark County. That's his home county. And in some other parts of the state. Mike Collins, though, he dominated really vast parts of middle and southwest Georgia, as well as parts of rural northwest Georgia. He did very well in the more sparsely populated, but remember, there's 159 counties. So he racked up big numbers in some of these sparsely populated, but still very conservative rural counties across big parts of Georgia. So he's going to be focusing on re-energizing that rural conservative base while cutting his losses in Metro Atlanta. He's going to try to keep the margins with Derek Dooley closer in Metro Atlanta counties that he lost in a pretty significant fashion in the first round of voting. Of course, like Collins, he finished with 41% of the vote, so he was the leading vote getter. The other part of the state we're watching really closely is Southeast Georgia. That's Buddy Carter's territory, and he won bigly in Chatham County, in the surrounding areas, in Glenn County, and the surrounding areas really that match the footprint of his first congressional district. Those voters, for the most part, are still up for grabs. Buddy Carter has not endorsed any candidate in this race, and so both Derek Dooley and Mike Collins are going after those southeastern Georgia, those coastal Georgia voters, very conservative voters. But along the sort of Chatham area, there might be more mainstream conservative, whereas other parts of the district, as you get further inland too, might be more rural, more MAGA friendly. So both these candidates are really, they're not only gunning for Buddy Carter's endorsement, which might never come, especially if you think about Mike Collins, who, he went after Buddy Carter pretty hard during the first phase of the campaign. But they're, of course, going after those voters. So we'll be watching super close to see how their messages resonate in coastal Georgia. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how gas politics is already fueling the early round of the general election in Georgia's race for governor. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. I'm your host, Greg Bluestein, here in my office, away from my office in Hilton Head Island. I'm finishing up a quick family vacation for the kids who finished up school. So I'm coming to you solo today. But you know what? There's so much to talk about. It's okay to go solo because I can just give you some of the hot take analysis of the last couple of days as we get into the home stretch right before the runoff. A reminder, if you've got a question you'd like to ask us here on Politically Georgia, you can call the Politically Georgia hotline anytime. Leave your question, and we'll play it back and answer it right here on the show during our Monday Mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. That's 770-810-5297. We cannot wait to hear from you. And a reminder, you can also email us politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. Producer Shani B and his legion of interns, they're always standing by, waiting for your requests. And Shani B, I think we've had a lot of them, haven't we?
We have. And you know what? Sometimes my interns and me, we fight over who gets to answer the phone because there are such great calls and there's so much to talk about.
Or keep them coming. The general election may still be months away. We're still not even done with the runoff phase, but former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms just gave us a big preview of one of the fights to come, and it starts at the gas pump. Governor Brian Kemp's suspension of Georgia's gas tax expired on Wednesday. That means drivers will once again pay the state's roughly 33-cent per gallon fuel tax. And the Democrat immediately jumped on the issue. She's urging Republicans to extend the suspension, and she's tying higher gas prices to President Donald Trump's war against Iran.
The price of gas at this station today, $4.19. And can you believe Republicans in this state are refusing to continue the suspension of the gas tax? That means this very high gas could go up even higher, possibly 33 more cents a gallon. If I were governor, I would extend the suspension of the gas tax. This is why elections matter, people. It matters to what we're paying every single day, every time we go to the gas pump. Please make sure you register to vote.
You can hear the cars in the background. You can hear the hum of diesel engines. You can tell that she's doing that ad at a gas station, a busy gas station somewhere in Atlanta. You know, Shani B, this reminds me of 2022, the last midterm that Georgia candidates were talking about gas politics. That was back when Stacey Abrams was in her rematch against Governor Brian Kemp. And during that campaign, she pushed the governor to extend an earlier gas tax suspension. He was doing it month to month, and each time he did it, he was getting a fresh round of media coverage and of headlines that his campaign, of course, embraced. She was saying, hey, look, if I was governor, I would just extend these tax breaks the rest of the year. So she was attacking the governor for not taking that step. And she actually put ads on thousands and thousands of gas pumps. So as you were fueling up your car for the holiday weekend trips you were taking, you couldn't help but see Stacey Abrams campaigning basically on this issue, getting a lot more name recognition. Not that she really needed more name recognition, but she was at least getting her campaign message out there even more, saying that the governor and the Republicans weren't going far enough. In the same election back in 2022, Senator Warnock, he supported a federal gas tax holiday, and his rival, a PAC backing his rival, Herschel Walker, in that campaign, came out with basically a plan to give folks gas vouchers for $25 that became kind of legally murky. But Republicans blame Democrats for fuel prices. Democrats blame Republicans for not doing enough and not embracing their plans to bring fuel prices down. So we're seeing that playing out again and again. Keisha Lance Bottoms is essentially saying if gas prices are rising, what are Republicans willing to do about it? And so far, we've seen Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and billionaire Rick Jackson. They're more focusing on each other. They're attacking Keisha Lance Bottoms plenty, but they're also focusing on each other ahead of this runoff. And they're also tying themselves directly to Governor Brian Kemp. Both of them have aired ads, very positive of the governor's agenda. So we don't expect them to come out and say anything negative about the governor's decision to end the suspension of these gas taxes. But what we're also seeing, it's an early attempt to turn a traditionally Republican issue, these tax breaks, into a Democratic attack line. It's tough, though. It's tough to continue these tax breaks. And why is that? Well, Georgia loses roughly $200 million a month in transportation funding that goes to roads and bridges and infrastructure improvements when the tax is suspended. So that money needs to be backfilled in some way. We know that this year, each of the each month, the $400 or so million plus revenue that Georgia lost was backfilled by the state surplus, at least in part. But the surplus is not bottomless. And, the Republican candidates, as well as Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, both have plans to use that surplus if they're elected. So Republicans are arguing that they're protecting long-term transportation funding, and they're also protecting the state budget by not extending this gas tax breaks. While Mayor Bottoms can argue that they're raising costs on consumers. It's a classic pocketbook fight. And pocketbook fights, we know, usually matter in gubernatorial races. Speaking of long-term political strategy, let's talk about another battle that isn't really about this election. It's about the next decade. If Donald Trump's endorsement is still the gold standard in Georgia Republican politics, Congressman Brian Jack's backing is becoming one of the next most valuable assets. The first-term congressman has quietly become a power center in the state Republican Party. He's helped steer support towards candidates like Clay Fuller, the newly elected congressman who succeeded Marjorie Taylor Greene. Houston Gaines, he's running to succeed Mike Collins in Northeast Georgia. And Jim Kingston, he is the Republican nominee for the race to succeed Buddy Carter in coastal Georgia. The larger project is what makes this so interesting, because this isn't just about filling open congressional seats. It's about building a farm team. For decades, Georgia wielded enormous influence in Washington through figures like Carl Vinson, Richard Russell, and then later in the 90s, Newt Gingrich. Later, Democrats like John Lewis and David Scott and Sanford Bishop, they built seniority and institutional power of their own. The common thread wasn't just ideology. It was longevity. They stayed, in some cases, for decades, even generations. They accumulated influence, they chaired committees, they built relationships, and they helped Georgia punch above its weight. Today, Georgia Republicans don't hold that same level of institutional power. There's no committee chairs, no House leadership posts. That's the problem that Congressman Jack and his allies are trying to solve. University of Georgia legendary political science professor Charles Bullock put it well. You can't build influence if everyone leaves after a few terms. The challenge isn't just electing young conservatives. It's convincing them to stay long enough to matter, convincing them not to run for higher office. Democrats have the same problem. So while much of the party is focused on the next election, what happens in the runoffs, what happens in the midterms, Jack and his allies are also trying to shape the next generation of Georgia Republican leadership. Whether it works may or may not be clear this year, or even 5 years from now. But it could help determine how much clout Georgia has in Washington for decades to come. And that's why it's a story worth watching. Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you enjoyed what you heard, please follow, rate, review us on your favorite podcast platform and share Politically Georgia with a friend. It helps others find our show and join our conversation. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.